Let's talk about preparing a file for 3D printing. It's possible to design something in MeshMixer that looks really great on the screen but won't print very well. And so there are a few considerations we need to make to be able to successfully send this out to the printer. The first is we need to consider scale, and that's because the 3D printer bed is only so large. And so if a part is just way too big, for example, then it will take a very long time to print or might be impossible to print. If, on the other hand, you make your part too small, then some of the details will be really, really fragile or won't print at all. So you want to find the happy medium. I think a good place for beginners to start is to go for a part that is about 100 millimeters in its largest dimension. And we can check the scale of this object by clicking on Analysis and Units Dimensions. And we see an indication here that it is 50 millimeters wide, 16 millimeters deep, and 40.8 tall. We can change that just by coming up here where X is listed. We'll enter 100, and you can see that the other dimensions update to maintain consistent scaling. We'll click Done. So now it's 100 millimeters this way. Now, another consideration we have to make as we're getting ready to send this job out to be printed is the form needs to be watertight. So if you imagine this virtual form as a vessel and pretend that we're going to pour virtual water into this virtual vessel. I'm talking about like pouring it into the interior of this form. You don't want that virtual water to leak out. If it does, it means that it's not watertight. And the problem with that is if there's a if the geometry is not a single closed solid, the 3D printer can get confused about how it's supposed to print out the form. It doesn't know what's inside and what's outside. So we can check to see if it's watertight and also check for errors by clicking on Inspector up top. And what we see is that it's throwing this blue line off, which shows that there's an opening in the form. So if we just zoom in on this area, you see how if we get really close, we can see pink on the interior? Let me actually just make this hole a little bit bigger. I think this is worth spending a few seconds on here. Let me select some of these forms, some of these faces rather, and delete them. And do you see how the interior is pink like that? That shows us that we're looking at back faces. And so again, we can use the inspector to close up this hole. So let's press Escape. I'll press S. Oh, I'm sorry, rather. We'll go to Analysis, click on Inspector. It shows us the blue line indicating an error, and we'll just click on Auto Repair All. And so there, it's fixed it. We'll click Done. Now, one final consideration I'll mention in this little segment here about getting ready for 3D printing is that we want to know that the part is thick enough everywhere. As it says in this manual I've put together, we want to make sure that all the features are at least 3 millimeters in thickness. And we can check that in the Analysis panel by going to Thickness. And you can see that it found one error here where it's a little bit too thin. So let's zoom in on that spot. And it actually looks like there's just a problem where the geometry doesn't quite line up very well. So let's just see if we can smooth that out and fix it. See that little ridge right there? I'll press 2 to open up my sculpting brushes. I'll hold down Shift to smooth. And let's see if actually just smoothing it out a little bit is enough to fix the issue. If this were a more extreme example and the geometry were too thin there, I would go to the draw brush and actually just add on a little bit of material. I think that might fix it though. So let's go back to Analysis, Thickness, and it found 2 other errors. So we could go in and find out what's going on here. You can see how it might require a bit of time adjusting these things by using the sculpting brushes, or you could even scale the object up a bit so that the whole thing is a little bit larger than 100 millimeters. And in that way make sure that there aren't any areas that are too thin to print.